8th, the honourable member from Kamloops, Thompson Caribou.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always a pleasure to rise on behalf of the people from Kamloops, Thompson Caribou, and this instance is no different. Although I wish it was a different circumstance. I wish we weren't speaking about Liberal corruption. Mr. Speaker, we hear the NDP talk a lot. I've often said, if this was a radio station, it would be all talk, no rock, because that's really what we're dealing with. If I could actually pose a question, and who knows, the NDP maybe answer this, whether they will eventually support a closure motion from this government. Who knows? If this were the old NDP, the pre-coalition NDP, I would say no. This was a party that historically fought for the underdog, that historically fought for Parliament, that recognized parliamentary supremacy with its limits, not many, but all of its effective exercises of discretion. That was the NDP, often known as the conscience of Parliament, a party that would challenge other parties to think about the ramifications of its decisions. In fact, that is what opposition parties are supposed to do. Opposition parties have a constitutional obligation to provide that opposition, conscientious opposition, thoughtful opposition, but opposition nonetheless when things aren't going right. And here we stand on the floor of the House of Commons looking at a scandal in which insiders got rich. Now, as a kid from North Kamloops, as I would say, as somebody whose parents immigrated to Canada without 2 pennies to rub together is the term I like to say, when I see the enrichment that took place on the backs of taxpayers, I am disgusted. There are people out there who are lining up at food banks as we speak, and Liberal insiders got rich. And if that isn't repugnant enough, the Liberals here will not provide the documents to tell us exactly who got what, when, and why. The NDP have said that they will vote in favor of this motion. Will they vote in favor of a closure motion from the government? I've heard before, I'm still trying to wrap my head around this, Mr. Speaker, about the charter rights. Now, it's no secret I was a lawyer. The charter is meant to protect citizens from the government. So when I hear the government stand up, and perhaps they can enlighten me, I'm certainly open to hearing it. Maybe there's something I'm missing about the charter, but the charter is meant to protect people from government action. It's always interesting because the Liberals like to use it as a sword. The charter was always meant to be a shield, to shield the people from the government. This is basically what they teach you in undergrad courses or first-year law, and yet the Liberals are talking about protecting themselves from the release of these documents, the government protecting itself, coming in here and saying, we don't want to release this because of the charter. Perhaps they can connect the dots, because I'm certainly open to hearing that. Even if there is an ongoing investigation and there are questions about that, and I understand the integrity of the investigation, Parliament has a job to do, notwithstanding that there is an investigation occurring. That's just the fact. Investigations typically take, of this magnitude, years to complete. And then you have to go through what's called a charge approval process, where somebody has to look at this. They have to get all the disclosure. We have the Jordan decision, which we know well in this chamber. All the disclosure. It could be years before we actually see any charges. If they're merited, that's for someone else to determine. Far be it for me to say whether somebody must be charged. That's for an independent prosecutor to determine. So where does that leave us, Mr. Speaker? It leaves us with a scandal where insiders, presumably people who are fairly well off to be in positions to further their own interest, in other words, to own a company and to further that interest, people who got richer. And they got richer on the backs of taxpayers. This is so disgusting. And as I say it, I feel myself getting more and more angry that we're standing here saying, Why aren't the documents just tabled? Like, is there anything more repugnant than stealing from the state? And when I say from the state, it's actually stealing from you, Mr. Speaker, from me. Whether somebody is like the 104-year-old veteran that I awarded a King Charles III Coronation Medal to, who fought for the freedoms, like that, stealing from him and his taxes, stealing from the newborn. These are the allegations that are before us, and frankly, a lot of them are substantiated. Whether it's criminal or not is another question. But what we know here is that there was a complete and utter misappropriation of funds. So much so that if I understand your ruling, Mr. Speaker, it is that we are dealing with nothing until we deal with this. The Liberals don't like that. Well, there's a pretty easy solution. They can put forward the documents. I was trying to think to myself, when you get into politics, obviously you think about pros and cons of any course of action. And I was thinking to myself, what is going through the Liberal machine right now? What's going through their heads? They can put forward the documents and bring an end to this, or they cannot. Now, what are the pros of doing that? Well, this is openness by default. I'll get to that in just a minute. Why won't they do this? Why won't they put them forward? And I'm thinking out loud here. There has to be something so damning in those documents that they refuse to put them forward, that grinding Parliament to a halt is worth it. They are prepared to put aside their legislative agenda because there is something in those documents that somebody in a Liberal back room or front room has said, we do not want to be revealed. What could possibly be that bad? What could possibly be that bad? To the person, I always make reference to my parents, and I apologize for those who watch my speeches, although I think it's just my mother. The reality is that I always think about the common person. I often will reference my father. He started loading boxcars by hand with wood at a sawmill when he was 17, 18. Did that till he could no longer medically do it, about 40 years. What does that say to him? What does that say to the person who newly immigrated to Canada and is looking at their pay stub, working any job they can, often because the Liberal government has been so slow to allow people who have immigrated to this country trained in fields that we need people in, doctors, nurses, other fields, that they are forced to work any job that they can take and see their paycheck evaporate into rising taxes, and then what's left evaporate into inflation. What does it say to them when this government, who's talking about the middle class and those hoping to join it, won't even tell the middle class and those hoping to join it who got rich off of their backs? This is utterly shameful. It's disgusting. And the Liberals will stand up. They'll invoke the ghost of Stephen Harper, who's not been here for 9 years. They talk about how terrible things are right now because of Stephen Harper 9 years ago. Talk about a lack of accountability, Mr. Speaker. You have this government not taking any sort of accountability. I'm sure the member from Winnipeg will stand up and ask a question for the 1624th time in this place. And at the end of the day, where do we get further? Just release the darn documents. Just release them. I'm going to pause here, Mr. Speaker. I think that this is an appropriate time to recognize two people in Kamloops Thompson Caribou who were recently engaged, one of whom is a young man that I spoke with, and who I've spoken with regularly. I've known his father. My mom actually worked with his father when she was beginning to be a legal assistant. My sister went to school with his aunt. His name is Spencer Paul, just a terrific young man beginning his teaching career. And I want to salute him and wish him and his fiancée, Yulia Voloshenko, all the best on their engagement, and I wish them a life of prosperity together. Now, Mr. Speaker, let's talk about openness by default. There's actually a professor, Matt Malone, I believe that Professor Malone's website that looks at various government order paper questions, things like that. It compiles them. Professor Malone has done great work called Open by Default. For a government that said it would be open by default, it has been anything but. We're standing here today because this is the height of a lack of transparency. This is a government that promised sunny ways, openness, transparency. And what do we hear? How many days have we been here? 4 or 5? Because this government is choosing to obfuscate. And this isn't even just deflection that a lot of politicians do. People do it on all sides. This isn't that. This is deliberate, not even obfuscation. This is deliberate stymieing. The Liberal government has chosen to ignore the will of this House because there's something so bad in those documents. I question, Mr. Speaker, why won't they just put them forward? And the Liberals will stand up and say, oh, but this person really isn't a Liberal. They were a Conservative once. Did you know that? I don't care who they are. They could have been my campaign manager. If they got rich off of the backs of taxpayers, they should be held accountable in this House and through whatever independent mechanisms there are. But the buck stops here when it comes to Parliament, and we should see those documents. They should be tabled. I don't care who they are, just like when it comes to the 11 who have either wittingly or unwittingly helped hostile states. I don't care if it's the person sitting next to me, they should be named. If they cannot be named here, then where can they be named? There's a Liberal government that has so much to hide. It is getting tired. And the expectation is that people will run defense for them, that people will do different things. People who stand here, who sit in the balcony at question period, and they question, why aren't the questions ever answered? Why do you have to ask the same question over and over and over again? And I would invite this rhetorically. If the Liberal members who are here, if this was a Conservative scandal, I wonder what their response would be. SDTC is supposed to be, well, for those at home, Sustainable Development Technology Canada is supposed to be an arm's length, not for-profit organization. It's supposed to be to support projects that develop and demonstrate technology. Here's the problem. SDTC executives awarded projects in which they held conflicts in over $330 million of taxpayer funds. $330 million. So let's go back to the middle class. How many middle class families does it take for their federal tax burden to equal $330 million? Now, we all know that the Prime Minister has lavish tastes and he has no problem pontificating about carbon taxes while he jet sets all around the country and still gets a carbon and tells people about how they've never had it so good with their carbon rebates that really don't make up the complete picture, that really don't tell people how much they're actually paying, especially when we think about tax upon tax and how it's levied at each and every single step. $330 million. So How did this happen? 2019, the Liberal Industry Minister, Navdeep Bains, began appointing people who would have conflicts of interest. These are Liberal appointees. So for those people who talk about Stephen Harper and, oh, this person served under Stephen Harper, as I heard earlier today, the SDTC appointees, they were done by the Liberal government 5 years ago. And if we know one thing about Liberals, is that Liberals help Liberals, Liberals want to fund Liberals, and Liberals appoint Liberals. And what did they start doing? They started giving themselves contracts. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. We're here in Parliament, Mr. Speaker. I talked about my roots being a kid from North Kamloops, the child of immigrants, thinking I would never probably be in a place like this. But if I ever had envisioned it 30 years ago, 20 years ago, the last thing I would be thinking is that a government would be stymieing the production of documents over people who got rich. And I'll make this clear. Anybody who works for me, if you use your position to get rich, you use your position to steal $20, I would have no problem terminating you on the spot. Period. Because that's what's expected. And yet, when it comes to the Liberal government, when it comes to them, having to deal with this scandal, they put up roadblock after roadblock. Why the roadblocks? Why are they hiding something? The reason is because there must be something substantial. There must be something explosive. And I invite people, watch question period. Watch the answers. Watch how little of substance is said. We have these vague references to charter rights. We have, well, the RCMP are investigating. We have nothing more to do. The RCMP are investigating. Well, last time I checked, we are not the RCMP, we are Parliament. And Parliament should have the right to figure out its own processes, and we do. And the people in the Liberals, they don't understand that there are actually separations. They say we as Conservatives want to meddle. Well, they don't realize that Parliament controls its own destiny and the RCMP control their own destiny. These are the documents that need to come. There were whistleblowers, and our whistleblower legislation, in my view, should be enhanced, that came forward and said, this is wrong. And this is so wrong that I'm prepared to put my career on the line for it. And what do they get? People who bravely came forward, putting their career on the line, they get stymied. And the member for Winnipeg North, I'm sure, is just going to stand up and tell us the reason why this shouldn't happen. When whistleblowers put their necks on the line so that Canadians can know the truth. Release the documents, give us the truth. It will set us free, especially the Liberals. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.